It was a sunny afternoon in a small suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where lawns are perfectly trimmed, kids ride their bikes down the street, and everything seems peaceful on the surface. But as we all know, appearances can be deceiving. On this particular day, the calm was interrupted by the sound of raised voices echoing from a tree-lined corner of the park near the neighborhood entrance. A woman in her late 40s, with a sharp voice and a demeanor that could cut glass, stood in the middle of the commotion. Let's call her Karen. She clutched her phone tightly in one hand, her other hand planted firmly on her hip as she stared down at a man sitting quietly on a bench a few feet away. The man looked tired, his clothes a little worse for wear, his hair unkempt, and his face weathered by what could only be years of hardship. He wasn't bothering anyone, just sitting there with his backpack at his feet and a small American flag pinned to the side of it. That small flag might have gone unnoticed by most people, but not Karen. She was already in full rant mode. "This is a public park," she barked into the phone, loud enough for everyone around to hear. "We pay taxes for this, and I will not stand for some vagrant loitering here, making this place unsafe." Her words were harsh, her tone icy, and her accusations far from the truth. The man, who we'll soon know as John, didn't respond. He just sat there, calm and quiet, like he'd been through this kind of situation before. His eyes, though those eyes told a story. They carried the weight of battles fought, struggles endured, and sacrifices made. Karen wasn't done. She paced in small circles, waving her hand dramatically as she spoke into the phone. "Yes, I want officers here immediately. He's been sitting here for hours. Who knows what he's planning? I saw him digging through the trash earlier. This is not acceptable." A few passers-by slowed their pace to see what was happening, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Some looked at Karen, clearly disapproving of her loud theatrics, while others glanced at John with a tinge of pity in their eyes. Still, no one stepped in. It's easier, isn't it? Easier to walk by, to avoid getting involved, to let someone else handle the problem. John didn't say a word. He just sat there, his hands resting on his knees, staring off into the distance like he'd seen it all before. And maybe he had. After all, John wasn't just any man. He was a U.S. veteran. Once, he had worn a uniform and served his country with pride. But life after service hadn't been kind to him. He'd fallen on hard times like so many others who had given so much but received so little in return. The minutes dragged on, and then the sound of sirens broke through the tension. Karen smirked, satisfied, and stood up a little straighter. Finally, she muttered to herself, "They'll take care of this." She turned to John, her voice dripping with disdain. "You're about to learn a lesson, buddy." Two police cars pulled up along the curb, their lights flashing but sirens silenced. Two officers stepped out, one male and one female. They looked around, taking in the scene, the agitated woman with her phone still in hand, the quiet man on the bench, and the small group of onlookers who had gathered at a distance. Karen wasted no time rushing over to them, her heels clicking against the pavement. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she began, gesturing wildly in John's direction. "This man has been loitering here all day, making people uncomfortable. I'm sure he's up to no good. He doesn't belong here." The male officer, whose name tag read Officer Williams, raised an eyebrow and glanced at John, who remained seated, calm and composed. "Ma'am, did he threaten you or anyone else? Has he done anything illegal?" he asked, his tone measured. Karen huffed, clearly frustrated that they weren't immediately hauling John away. "No, but just look at him. He's clearly homeless, probably dangerous. I mean, who knows what kind of diseases he's carrying. He's not from around here." Officer Williams exchanged a look with his partner, Officer Ramirez. Something unspoken passed between them before they turned their attention back to John. The officers approached him slowly, their movements careful but not threatening. "Sir, would you mind standing up for a moment?" Officer Ramirez asked gently. John nodded and stood, his movements deliberate, his posture straight despite the weariness in his body. He looked Officer Williams in the eye, then Ramirez, and said simply, "I'm not here to cause any trouble. Just needed a quiet place to sit for a while." It was then that Officer Ramirez noticed the small flag pinned to John's backpack. Her eyes softened, and she nodded toward it. Are you a veteran? She asked. John hesitated for a moment before replying, Yes, ma'am. Served in the army. A long time ago. And just like that, the dynamic shifted. Officer Williams looked back at Karen, who was already growing impatient. What are you waiting for? She demanded. Aren't you going to arrest him or something? But instead of cuffing John, Officer Williams turned to Karen, his expression calm but firm. Ma'am, this man isn't breaking any laws by sitting in a public park. He has every right to be here. Karen's mouth fell open, but before she could launch into another tirade, Officer Ramirez stepped closer to John. Sir, do you need any assistance? Housing? Food? Anything we can help with? And that's when everything took a turn that Karen never expected. John looked at Officer Ramirez, his expression unreadable for a moment. He wasn't used to kindness, not anymore. For years, he'd been invisible, just another face in the crowd, another person people avoided making eye contact with. Slowly, he nodded. I could use some help, he admitted, his voice quiet but steady. Karen's face flushed red with frustration. Oh, you gotta be kidding me. You're supposed to remove him, not pamper him, she exclaimed, her voice growing shrill. This is exactly the problem these days. Everyone just coddles these people instead of holding them accountable. Officer Williams turned to Karen, his calm demeanor unwavering. Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but we're here to serve the community, and that includes everyone. If this man hasn't broken any laws, there's no reason to remove him. Karen threw her hands in the air. This is unbelievable. He's probably some scam artist pretending to be a veteran just to get sympathy, she snapped. Her words hung in the air like a bitter cloud, and a few of the onlookers shifted uncomfortably. But John didn't react. He'd heard worse before, and he wasn't about to let her words get under his skin. Instead, he looked back at Officer Ramirez and said, I'm not pretending. I served in Desert Storm, 8th Infantry Division. The mention of his service caught Ramirez's attention. Her expression softened further, and she asked, Do you have any ID or proof of service with you? John hesitated, reaching for his backpack. He unzipped it carefully, revealing a few tattered belongings, a worn-out jacket, an old pair of boots, and a water bottle with a dented cap. From one of the side pockets, he pulled out a laminated card. It was his VA card, edges frayed but still legible. He handed it to Officer Ramirez, who inspected it closely. Karen scoffed loudly. Oh, please. That doesn't mean anything. Anyone could fake one of those. Officer Williams turned to Karen again, his tone sharper now. Ma'am, I need you to calm down. We're doing our job, and right now, that means helping someone in need. If you can't remain civil, we'll have to ask you to leave. Karen's jaw dropped, her indignation flaring even higher. Leave? Me? I'm the one who called you. John, still standing quietly, watched the scene unfold. He wasn't sure what to expect next, but he could feel the tension thickening. He had grown accustomed to people like Karen, people who judged him without knowing his story, who assumed the worst because of how he looked or where he was sitting. What he wasn't used to was this. A pair of officers who seemed more interested in helping him than in simply moving him along. Officer Ramirez handed John's VA card back to him. Thank you, sir, she said. We appreciate your service. Her words were genuine, and for a moment, John felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Dignity. Karen, meanwhile, was seething. You're just going to let him stay here? She demanded. What about the safety of the community? What about the kids who play here? Are you seriously going to ignore that? Officer Williams glanced at her, his patience clearly wearing thin. Ma'am, there's no indication that this man poses any threat to anyone. If anything, he's the one who's been threatened by the assumptions and accusations being made here. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, another voice spoke up. It came from one of the onlookers, a middle-aged man in a baseball cap who had been standing off to the side, watching everything unfold. Hey, hold on, he said, stepping forward. I recognize you. John looked up surprised. The man pointed at him. You were in the paper a few years back. You helped save those people when that apartment building caught fire, didn't you? John blinked, unsure how to respond. It had been years ago, but he remembered it well. He had been passing by a burning building when he heard screams for help. Without thinking, he had run inside and pulled two people out before the fire department arrived. It hadn't been a big story, just a small article in the local paper, but clearly someone had remembered. Karen looked flustered, her confidence shaken for the first time. That doesn't mean anything, she stammered. He could still be dangerous. People like him always are. The man in the baseball cap shook his head. No, you don't know what you're talking about. This guy's a hero. What have you done for the community lately? Karen's face turned an even deeper shade of red. She muttered something under her breath, but she didn't have a good comeback. Officer Ramirez looked at John again. Is that true? She asked. Were you involved in that fire rescue? John nodded slowly. It wasn't a big deal, he said. Just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Officer Williams exchanged another look with Ramirez, and they both seemed to come to an unspoken agreement. Ramirez turned to John. Sir, do you have a place to stay tonight? John hesitated. Not really, he admitted. We can connect you with a local shelter, she said. And there are some programs through the VA that might be able to help you get back on your feet. Would you be open to that? John hesitated again, his pride warring with his need for help. Finally, he nodded. Yeah, he said quietly. I'd appreciate that. Karen, now standing off to the side, looked like she was ready to explode. This is ridiculous, she muttered, but she didn't say anything else. As the officers began making arrangements for John, a sense of quiet fell over the small crowd. Some of the onlookers stepped forward to shake John's hand or offer him a few kind words. The man in the baseball cap even slipped him a $20 bill, whispering, "Thank you for your service." But even as things seemed to settle, there was a lingering tension in the air. Karen remained rooted in place, her arms crossed, her expression dark. She wasn't done, not by a long shot. And that's when something unexpected happened, a twist no one saw coming, something that would change everything. Just as Officer Ramirez finished making a call to arrange temporary housing for John, Karen's voice sliced through the calm like a blade. You're making a mistake, she said, her tone sharper now, almost defiant. People like him, they don't change. You give them an inch, and they'll take a mile. I'm warning you, he's going to cause trouble. You're just too blind to see it. Officer Williams turned to Karen, his expression serious but calm. Ma'am, we've already explained that this man hasn't broken any laws and isn't a threat. Now, unless you have new information to provide, we need you to step aside so we can do our job. Karen's lips tightened into a thin line, but she didn't move. You think you know everything, don't you? She snapped. You think this is just about one man sitting on a bench? This is about keeping our community safe, about protecting what we've built here. I'm not the bad guy for wanting that. John, still standing nearby, looked at her for the first time with a mix of exhaustion and quiet resolve. I'm not trying to take anything from you, he said, his voice steady despite the weight of her accusations. I'm just trying to survive. That's all? Karen laughed bitterly, shaking her head. Spare me the sob story, she said. We all have struggles. That doesn't give you the right to make everyone else uncomfortable. The man in the baseball cap, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward again. You know what's really uncomfortable? He said, his voice rising just enough to draw attention. Watching someone tear down a man who's done more for this country than most people ever will. You don't know his story, lady. Maybe it's time you listened instead of judging. Karen shot him a withering glare. Oh, please. Are we really going to turn this into some hero worship moment? Plenty of people serve in the military and don't end up like this. Maybe he made some bad choices. Maybe this is his own fault. John flinched ever so slightly at her words, but he didn't respond. He'd heard it all before. Every excuse, every assumption, every reason why his struggles were somehow his own doing. What Karen didn't know, what she couldn't know, was the full story behind the man she was so quick to condemn. John had enlisted when he was just 18, full of hope and determination to make a difference. He had served honorably, enduring the hardships and dangers that came with his duty. But when his service ended, the real battle began. Adjusting to civilian life hadn't been easy. Jobs were scarce, his PSD went untreated for years, and the support he had hoped for simply wasn't there. One setback led to another, and before he knew it, he was sleeping in shelters, trying to hold on to whatever shred of dignity he had left. But none of that mattered to Karen. All she saw was a man sitting on a bench with a backpack, and in her eyes, that was enough to make him a threat. Officer Ramirez stepped between Karen and John, her expression firm. "Ma'am, I think it's time for you to leave. We're handling this situation, and your input is no longer needed." Karen's face flushed with anger. "You're protecting him because it's the easy thing to do," she hissed. "But when something goes wrong, don't say I didn't warn you." Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and marched away, her heels clicking against the pavement. The tension in the air seemed to lift slightly as she disappeared from view, but it wasn't gone entirely. Officer Williams turned back to John. "Sorry about that," he said. "Some people just, well, they don't understand." John nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I'm used to it," he said simply. The officer spent a few more minutes finalizing the arrangements for John, ensuring he would have a safe place to sleep that night. As they wrapped up, the man in the baseball cap lingered nearby, watching. When the officers left, the man approached John. "Hey," he said, his tone softer now. "I wasn't trying to make a scene back there, but I couldn't just stand by and let her talk to you like that." John looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Thanks," he said after a moment. The man hesitated, then extended his hand. "Name's Mike," he said. "I run a hardware store a few blocks from here. If you ever need work, real work, I might be able to help you out." John hesitated, looking at the hand extended toward him. It had been a long time since anyone had offered him something more than pity or a few spare coins. Slowly, he reached out and shook Mike's hand. "Thank you," John said quietly. Mike nodded. "Don't mention it. Just take care of yourself, all right?" As Mike walked away, John sat back down on the bench, his backpack resting at his feet. The park was quiet now, the crowd having dispersed. And for the first time in what felt like forever, John allowed himself a moment to breathe. But even as the park returned to its peaceful state, something about Karen's departure lingered in the air. The way she had stormed off, her words sharp and cutting, left a bitter aftertaste. It was clear she wasn't done, not by a long shot. And somewhere just out of sight, Karen was already making plans. This wasn't over for her. Not yet. The next few days passed quietly, or at least that's how it seemed on the surface. John had moved into the temporary shelter arranged by the officers, a modest but clean place with a bed, meals, and access to resources he hadn't had in years. For the first time in what felt like forever, he could sleep without constantly looking over his shoulder. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He even stopped by Mike's hardware store one afternoon. It wasn't a formal job offer, not yet, but Mike let him help out in small ways. Restocking shelves, sweeping the floor, small tasks that gave John a sense of purpose. Mike didn't ask too many questions, which John appreciated. There was an unspoken understanding between them, and for that, John was grateful. But while John was quietly trying to rebuild his life, Karen was far from quiet. She hadn't forgotten what had happened in the park, and she certainly hadn't forgiven. To her, the entire incident had been a personal affront, a challenge to her authority and her vision of what the community should be. And she wasn't about to let it go. Karen began making phone calls, first to her friends, then to the local neighborhood association. She painted a picture of a growing problem in the area, emphasizing how unsafe it had become with people like John around. She carefully avoided naming him outright, but her descriptions left little room for doubt about who she was referring to. "Do we really want this kind of thing happening in our parks?" she said during one of the meetings she had hastily organized. "It starts with one or two, but before you know it, the whole area goes downhill. Property values drop, families stop coming, and our community suffers. We have to act now before it's too late." Her words stirred up a mix of reactions. Some of the attendees nodded in agreement, buying into her narrative without question. Others seemed uncomfortable, unsure if Karen was being proactive or simply paranoid. But Karen was persuasive, and her determination was infectious. By the end of the meeting, she had convinced enough people to back her plan, though not everyone left feeling entirely at ease. What Karen didn't know was that her actions were already creating ripples. A few of the people from the meeting, uneasy with how far Karen seemed willing to go, mentioned it to others. Word spread quickly, and soon, John's name came up in conversations he wasn't even part of. Some people defended him, sharing stories about his military service and his quiet demeanor. Others weren't so kind, repeating Karen's warnings about dangerous individuals and the risks of letting things slide. John began to notice the stares when he walked down the street or sat on a bench. It wasn't the same as before. It wasn't just the indifferent glances of strangers. These looks were pointed, curious, sometimes even hostile. He overheard snippets of conversations, whispers that stopped abruptly when he passed by. At first, he tried to ignore it. He told himself it didn't matter what people thought, as long as he was doing the right thing. But the tension around him was impossible to ignore, and it followed him everywhere. One evening, as John left Mike's hardware store, he noticed a group of people gathered at the end of the block. Karen was among them, her voice rising above the murmur of the crowd. She held a clipboard in one hand and was talking animatedly to the group, gesturing in the direction of the park. "They're not listening to us," she was saying. "The police are more interested in coddling these people than protecting the rest of us. If we want to see real change, we have to take matters into our own hands." John stopped in his tracks, watching from a distance. He didn't need to hear the rest to know what she was talking about. Karen's campaign against him wasn't just continuing, it was escalating. That night, as John walked back to the shelter, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that he was being followed. The streets were quiet, the only sounds coming from the occasional passing car and the faint hum of distant traffic. But every so often, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye, a shadow darting behind a building, the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. He quickened his pace, his heart pounding. It wasn't fear that gripped him so much as a deep sense of frustration. No matter how much he tried to stay out of trouble, trouble always seemed to find him. When he finally reached the shelter, he paused at the entrance, glancing back down the street. The shadows were still, the footsteps gone. But the unease lingered, wrapping around him like a cold wind. The next morning, things took an even darker turn. As John stepped out of the shelter to start his day, he noticed something on the sidewalk just outside the building. It was a crude sign, hastily made with spray, paint, and cardboard, but its message was clear: "Get out of our neighborhood." John stared at the sign, his jaw tightening. A few of the other shelter residents stepped outside and saw it too, their expressions ranging from anger to resignation. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But for John, this was personal. He didn't know who had left the sign, but he had a sinking feeling Karen was behind it. Or at the very least, her words had inspired someone to take action. As the day went on, the tension continued to build. More whispers, more stares, more signs of a community divided. Mike stopped by the shelter that afternoon, his expression grim. "Something's going on," he said quietly, pulling John aside. "Karen's stirring people up, and I don't think she's going to stop until she gets what she wants. You need to be careful." John nodded, but he didn't respond. He didn't know what to say. How do you fight back against someone who's already made up their mind about you? How do you defend yourself when the court of public opinion has already cast its verdict? As night fell, the unease grew heavier. The shelter staff warned everyone to stay inside, just in case. But John couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, staring out at the darkened street, waiting for something to happen. And then, just before midnight, it did. A noise shattered the stillness. A loud bang, followed by the sound of glass breaking. John bolted to his feet, his heart racing. He looked outside and saw shadows moving near the building. It wasn't just one person. It was a group, and they weren't there by accident. For John, the moment he had been dreading was here. Whatever was about to happen, there was no avoiding it now. John stood frozen for a moment, his eyes locked on the shifting shadows outside. His breathing was shallow, and his heart pounded in his chest. The crash had roused others in the shelter, and soon people were peeking out from behind curtains or cautiously approaching the windows. The dim light from a street lamp illuminated the figures outside. 3, maybe 4 people, dressed in dark clothes and moving with clear purpose. "What's going on?" one of the shelter residents asked, her voice shaking. John didn't answer immediately. His mind raced as he tried to figure out what their intent was. Were they just trying to intimidate? Or was this going to escalate into something worse? Before he could react, Another loud bang echoed through the street. A rock hurled at one of the shelter's windows. The glass didn't shatter completely, but a jagged crack spread across its surface. Someone inside screamed, and the tension reached a boiling point. John knew he couldn't just stand there. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat and stepped outside, ignoring the calls from the shelter staff to stay put. As he emerged into the cold night air, the group froze, startled by his sudden appearance. "What do you think you're doing?" John's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that even surprised him. One of the figures stepped forward, a tall man with a hood pulled low over his face. He held a can of spray paint in one hand, and the strong smell of fresh paint lingered in the air. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at John as if sizing him up. "You're not welcome here," the man finally said, his tone cold and direct. John clenched his fists at his sides. "I don't want trouble," he said. "But this isn't the way." The man scoffed, shaking his head. "You think you get a say in this? People like you are the reason this neighborhood is going downhill. You don't belong here." John could feel the anger rising in him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had been in enough situations to know that letting emotions take over wouldn't help. Still, the words stung more than he cared to admit. "People like me?" John said, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. "Do you even know who I am? What I've been through? Or are you just listening to someone else's version of the story?" The man hesitated, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Enough!" Everyone turned to see Officer Ramirez approaching, her patrol car parked at the curb with its lights flashing. She had her hand on her radio, and her expression was a mix of frustration and authority. "This ends now," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. The group exchanged glances, their bravado fading in the face of her presence. Slowly, they began to back away, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as they had appeared. Ramirez stayed where she was, watching them go before turning her attention to John. "You all right?" she asked, her voice softer now. John nodded, though his hands were still trembling. "I'm fine," he said, though it wasn't entirely true. Ramirez looked at the damaged window and the graffiti scrawled across the side of the building. Her jaw tightened, and she let out a heavy sigh. "This is getting out of hand," she said. "I've already filed a report about Karen's complaints and the tension it's been causing. But now this? Someone's crossed the line." John didn't respond right away. He stared at the words spray-painted on the wall, "No freeloaders," and felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. It wasn't just the physical toll of the night. It was the emotional weight of constantly having to justify his existence to people who didn't know him. "This isn't just about me," John said finally. "It's about all of us. People are scared, and she's feeding into that fear. But fear doesn't solve anything. It just makes everything worse." Ramirez nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You're right," she said. "But dealing with fear takes time, and right now, we need to focus on keeping you and everyone else here safe." As they spoke, a car slowly drove by, its headlights briefly illuminating the shelter. John glanced at it, his instincts kicking in. Something about the car seemed familiar, but before he could place it, it turned the corner and disappeared. "Do you know who they were?" Ramirez asked, motioning toward the direction the group had gone. John shook his head. "No, but I have a feeling they're not done." He wasn't wrong. Over the next few days, small incidents continued to pile up. Another sign appeared outside the shelter, this one more threatening than the last. People reported hearing whispers about taking back the neighborhood, and John noticed that even some of the shelter's regular volunteers seemed hesitant to stay as long as they used to. Then, one afternoon, as John was walking back from Mike's store, he spotted Karen standing across the street from the shelter. She wasn't alone this time. Several people were with her, holding signs and chanting slogans about restoring community values. John stopped in his tracks, his stomach sinking. This wasn't just Karen anymore. She had managed to rally a group of people who shared her views, and now they were making their presence known. Mike, who had been walking with John, glanced at the group and let out a low whistle. "She's not messing around, is she?" "No," John said quietly. "She's not." As they approached the shelter, the chanting grew louder, and a few of the protesters turned their attention directly to John. One of them, a middle-aged man with a megaphone, pointed at him. "There he is," the man shouted. "The freeloader who's bringing this place down." John felt his pulse quicken as every eye in the crowd seemed to focus on him. He could feel the anger radiating from them, fueled by Karen's rhetoric and their own fears. But before John could say anything, another voice rang out, this one firm and commanding. "All right, that's enough." It was Officer Williams, stepping out of his patrol car and making his way toward the crowd. Ramirez was with him, and the two officers quickly positioned themselves between the protesters and the shelter. "This is public property," Williams said. "You have a right to protest, but you do not have a right to harass or threaten anyone. If you can't follow the law, we'll have to take action." Karen stepped forward, her expression defiant. "We're not threatening anyone," she said. "We're exercising our rights as citizens to stand up for what's right." Williams raised an eyebrow. "And spray painting threats on the side of a building? That's part of your rights too." Karen faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "We're here to make our voices heard. Nothing more." Ramirez stepped closer to Karen, her voice low but firm. "We're watching, Karen. Don't make the mistake of thinking you're above the law." Karen's expression hardened, but she didn't say anything else. The crowd began to disperse shortly after, though not without a few lingering glares and muttered words. As the street grew quiet again, John turned to Ramirez and Williams. "This isn't going to stop, is it?" he asked. Ramirez looked at him, her expression a mix of determination and sympathy. "Not unless we stop it," she said. But even as she spoke, John couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point the following evening. John sat by the shelter's front window, gazing out at the street as if waiting for something to happen. He wasn't sure why he felt so uneasy, but there was a heaviness in the air, a sense that things were about to come to a head. Mike stopped by the shelter to drop off some supplies he had picked up earlier in the day. "You all right?" he asked, noticing John's distant expression. John nodded, but didn't say much. "Just trying to figure out what's next," he replied, though he didn't elaborate. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the streetlights flickered on, the faint sound of voices drifted through the air. John stood and moved closer to the window, his stomach tightening when he saw a small group gathering near the park across the street. It wasn't a protest this time. There were no signs, no chants, but their body language said enough. Karen was at the center of the group, her arms crossed and her face set in a grim expression. She was speaking to the others in hushed tones, gesturing toward the shelter with sharp, deliberate movements. Whatever she was planning, it wasn't good. John stepped outside, determined to confront her before things escalated any further. As he approached the group, Karen spotted him and raised her voice, her tone laced with disdain. "There he is," she said loudly, pointing at John. "The man who thinks he can just take and take without giving anything back. You don't belong here, and we're not going to let you ruin our community." John took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Karen," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you don't know me. You don't know what I've been through or why I'm here. All you've done is make assumptions and spread fear. But this isn't the way to fix anything." Karen scoffed, shaking her head. "Don't try to play the victim," she snapped. "You've been given every opportunity, and you've squandered it. People like you are the reason this neighborhood is falling apart." Before John could respond, a voice came from behind him. "That's enough." It was Officer Ramirez, stepping out of her patrol car with a look of determination on her face. She was followed closely by Officer Williams, who carried a file in his hand. The group fell silent as the officers approached, the tension thick in the air. "Karen," Ramirez said, her voice steady, "we've been investigating the recent incidents around here, including the vandalism at the shelter and the threats made against its residents. And we've uncovered some interesting information." Karen's confident demeanor faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice defensive. Williams stepped forward, holding up the file. "We spoke to several witnesses and reviewed security footage from nearby businesses," he said. "And we found evidence linking you to the group responsible for the vandalism. In fact, We have video of you purchasing the spray paint used in the graffiti. Karen's face turned pale, but she remained silent. The group around her began to shift uncomfortably, some of them exchanging uneasy glances. But that's not all, Ramirez continued. We also discovered that you've been organizing these gatherings without the proper permits, violating multiple city ordinances. And we've received complaints from other residents about your behavior, including harassment and intimidation. Karen's composure finally cracked. This is ridiculous, she shouted. I'm trying to protect our community, and this is how you repay me? By siding with people who don't even belong here. Ramirez shook her head. This isn't about sides, she said. It's about the law, and no one is above it. Not even you. As Ramirez spoke, the group around Karen began to disperse, their confidence in her leadership clearly shaken. One by one, they slipped away, leaving Karen standing alone in the dim light of the street lamp. John watched the scene unfold, a mix of relief and disbelief washing over him. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe again. But just as the tension seemed to dissipate, a voice called out from the shadows. Wait! Everyone turned to see a man stepping forward from the darkness. It was one of the shelter residents, a quiet man named Marcus who rarely spoke, but always seemed to be watching. I think there's something else you should know, Marcus said, his voice steady. Karen's not just targeting John. She's been trying to buy up properties around here for months, offering lowball prices to people who are struggling. She wants to turn this neighborhood into her own little empire. Karen's eyes widened, and for the first time, she seemed genuinely caught off guard. That's a lie, she exclaimed. I've done no such thing. But Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. I kept the letter you sent me, he said, holding it up for everyone to see. You said if I didn't sell, you'd make sure the neighborhood was unlivable until I changed my mind. Looks like you made good on that promise. The crowd that had gathered nearby erupted into murmurs, the mood shifting from uneasy to outright angry. Karen's plan had backfired spectacularly, and there was no recovering from it now. As Ramirez took the letter and began asking Marcus for more details, John felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The truth had finally come to light, and Karen's reign of fear was over. But as he turned to head back into the shelter, he noticed something strange. Across the street, parked just out of sight, was the same car he had seen the night of the vandalism. The engine was running, and a figure sat behind the wheel, watching intently. John frowned, a sense of unease creeping back in. Who were they? And why did they seem so interested in him? As the car slowly pulled away, disappearing into the night, John realized that while this chapter of his story was ending, another one was just beginning. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different, almost as if a heavy fog had lifted. The usual tension that had hung in the air was gone, replaced with a cautious but noticeable quiet. John stood outside the shelter, sipping a cup of coffee as he watched the sunrise. The events of the night before still replayed in his mind. Karen's outburst, Marcus's revelation, and that mysterious car. All of it had left him both relieved and unsettled. Inside the shelter, the residents were starting their morning routines. Some were in the kitchen, helping prepare breakfast, while others gathered around the small TV in the corner. There was a sense of community, a feeling that despite everything they had been through, they were still standing together. That gave John hope. He had always believed in the strength of people when they came together, and seeing it firsthand reminded him why he fought so hard to protect this place. Officer Ramirez stopped by later that morning, holding a steaming cup of coffee from a nearby cafe. She greeted John with a small smile, though the weariness in her eyes was evident. Busy night, she said, leaning against the railing beside him. Tell me about it, John replied, shaking his head. What's going to happen to Karen? Ramirez sighed, taking a sip of her coffee. Well, she's in a lot of trouble. Between the threats, the vandalism, and the reports we've gathered about her property schemes, she'll be dealing with legal consequences for a while. And honestly, I think her reputation in this neighborhood is beyond repair. John nodded slowly. He didn't feel triumphant about Karen's downfall. It wasn't in his nature to take pleasure in someone else's failure. But he did feel a sense of justice, a sense that maybe now the shelter and its residents could finally breathe without constantly looking over their shoulders. "What about the car?" John asked, glancing down the street as if expecting it to reappear. "The one that was watching us last night?" Ramirez followed his gaze, her brow furrowing. "We're looking into it," she said. "Could be nothing, but it's strange. If you see it again, let me know. We're not ruling anything out." The thought of someone still watching made John uneasy, but he pushed it aside. There was enough to worry about without diving into more unknowns. For now, he wanted to focus on the good, on the fact that the shelter had weathered one of its toughest storms and come out stronger on the other side. As the days passed, the tension in the neighborhood eased. The graffiti was cleaned up, the broken window repaired, and people started to feel safe again. Volunteers who had hesitated to return began showing up with fresh energy, bringing meals, supplies, and smiles. The shelter's residents seemed lighter too, more willing to engage with the community instead of keeping to themselves. It was a small but meaningful shift, and John knew it was a step in the right direction. One afternoon, as John was helping a few residents set up a small garden in the back of the shelter, Mike showed up with a box of seedlings and a grin on his face. "Figured you could use these," he said, setting the box down. "Nothing like a little green to brighten things up." "Thanks, Mike," John said, genuinely touched. "This means a lot." Mike waved him off. "You've been doing the hard work, man. I'm just glad to help." The two men worked side by side for a while, planting the seedlings and talking about everything and nothing. It was a simple moment, but it reminded John of how much support he had in this community, even when things felt darkest. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and cast a warm glow over the neighborhood, John stood in the garden, admiring the rows of freshly planted vegetables and flowers. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, things were finally settling down. But as he turned to head back inside, he spotted something on the edge of the property, a small envelope tucked under a rock near the fence. Curious, he walked over and picked it up, unfolding the paper inside. The note was short, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. "This isn't over. Watch your back." John's stomach dropped. The words were simple, but their meaning was clear. Whoever had written the note wasn't done with him or the shelter. He looked around, scanning the street for any sign of the mysterious car or anyone watching, but the area was quiet, almost too quiet. He took the note inside and showed it to Ramirez the next day. She read it carefully, her expression hardening. "Looks like someone isn't ready to let this go," she said. "We'll increase patrols in the area and keep an eye on things. You let me know if you see or hear anything suspicious, all right?" John nodded, but the uneasy feeling lingered. He didn't want to worry the shelter's residents, so he kept the note to himself, but he couldn't shake the sense that the fight wasn't entirely over. Even so, he refused to let fear take over. The shelter was his home, his community, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that away. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be. The shelter continued its work, providing food, shelter, and support to those who needed it most. The garden flourished, becoming a small symbol of hope and renewal for everyone who saw it. And while John remained vigilant, he also allowed himself to enjoy the little victories, the smiles of the residents, the laughter of volunteers, the quiet moments of peace. One day, as he was sitting on the steps of the shelter, watching the world go by, Marcus joined him. The usually quiet man looked more relaxed than John had ever seen him, and for the first time in a while, he spoke without hesitation. "You've done good here," Marcus said, his voice steady. "This place, it's more than just a roof. It's a chance, a reminder that things can get better." John looked at Marcus, feeling a surge of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without all of you," he said. "This isn't just my fight. It's ours." As the two men sat in comfortable silence, the sounds of the neighborhood filled the air. Children playing, neighbors chatting, the hum of life carrying on. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. The mysterious car never reappeared, and while the note remained a nagging reminder of unresolved tensions, John chose to focus on what he could control. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he wasn't alone. And that, more than anything, gave him strength. In the end, the story wasn't just about Karen or the shelter or even John himself. It was about a community learning to stand together, to push back against fear and division, and to find hope in the face of adversity. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's always a chance for light to break through. And as John looked out at the garden, now blooming with vibrant colors, he allowed himself to believe that brighter days were ahead. For him, for the shelter, and for everyone who had fought so hard to make this place a home.